Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction. I would also like to thank the organizer for giving me that really great honor to present you this Mike Memorial Lecture today. Mike was definitely one of the best swine immunologists, and our community had a great loss last year. Good. As Ying said, the title of my talk today is The Adaptive Immune Response to PRRS, and I would like to dive right into it. So I have to admit I did not interact with Mike Murtaugh a lot, but I have one memory I would like to share with you because I think I will never forget that one in my life. Who knows where that is? I know one is. Shout it out. No? Gila, come on. Budapest, exactly. That is the Hungarian parliament in Budapest, and this is where I actually met Mike. So in 2012, Budapest was hosting the Euro-PRRS meeting, and at that time I just completed my PhD on the characterization of Tregs in swine, and I started to look at their role in PRRS infections. And I maneuvered myself during that Congress and during an open panel into quite a heated argument. And at the early stage of my career, I was a bit shaken afterwards. So I see still myself standing in the back of the room, and this is when Mike actually came over, and I can't remember his words anymore, but it felt like, good job, boy. There was just that really well-known person coming over and then congratulating me to actually critically evaluating the research in one specific area. And what happened, so that already gave me a lot of comfort, but what happened next was then actually, total ease of my mind, because when I was discussing one tiny subject of PRRS, he basically just challenged everything in PRRS research during one talk. And that was the title of his talk. It was really harmless immunopathological consequences of PRRS infection. So people didn't expect too much, although the ones who read the abstract, they already knew what might be coming up. And I just want to read basically one sentence of this abstract. So that was Mike's talk on that. Here we re-examine generally accepted facts about PRRS immunity that are incorrect, need to be reconsidered, or may not apply to PRRS isolates that now circulate in major swine production regions of the world. So he came out and just stood in front of everyone and said, you should reconsider what you are actually thinking is going on. And I think this, takes great bravery. Now I would like to start with trying to honor him by following his spirit. And the one generally accepted fact I would like to talk about at the beginning is that the neutralizing antibody response to PRRS is delayed. And the reason why I would like to address that and why I think this might not be appropriate, at least to currently ongoing strains anymore, is the results we got in a 2018 trial. And here is basically how the trial looked like. So this was a really basic general assessment of the adaptive immune response to PRRS, and therefore we infected pigs with either we inoculated pigs either with a modified live virus vaccine based on the VR2332 strain, or we infected them with currently circulating PRRS strains from North Carolina, so a low-path strain, which is 134, and in red you see the 174. And these colors you will find throughout the talk. And then afterwards, then we took blood samples throughout the study, and we analyzed them in vitro on the viremia, on the humoral, and the T-cell immune response. And as I said, I would like to start basically on the one side with the viremia, but also focus then on the humoral immune response. Good. So what we saw with our viremia is that we had about 7 days a high peak of the genomic copies. This is basically what you see if you infect pigs or if you vaccinate them. And then at 28 days, we had a sharp drop of that viremia with a few rebounds later on. And that 28 days will become more important later on. So basically what this shows you is that our PRRS vaccination and the infection work, so it's following the standard infection trend. If we now look at the antibody response to PRRS, and we send sera out to Iowa State that they determine the anti-PRRS serum IgG. Also, this was nothing new. About 7 to 10 days is when actually the serum IgG levels started to increase. Pretty normal. And I hope you can see that here at the bottom. We perform now our own neutralizing antibody assays using flow cytometry, and we were quite surprised because here is when we saw a big difference from what we actually saw in the literature. I just need to start that laser pointer. Good. Yes, you can see that. So here basically is what you see. If you use the VR2332 strain, where most of the research is actually done on or has been done on, you see that delay of 28 to 35 days, what you always read in literature. But if you now look at the new circulating strains, these antibody titers, these neutralizing antibodies actually also appear at 7 to 10 days. So there was absolutely no delay in these neutralizing antibodies. And at the beginning we weren't quite sure, is it our new technology which is just more sensitive and that's why we see it, or would we also see it with the standard FFN test? So we sent out our sera to South Dakota and they came up with exactly the same results. So they completely confirmed that in our North Carolina strains we do not see a delay in these neutralizing antibodies. So basically the first take-home message of that talk is that the neutralizing antibody response, at least in some circulating strains, is not delayed in PRRS. Good. Now we know everything about the anti-PRRS immune response, right? Well, this is very often what is actually performed if you evaluate the immune response to PRRS. The antibody response, and this is basically what you see. And this is what you're missing. So there is a whole lot of other things going on, and most of the times these this cell-mediated immune response is not analyzed. And that's why I would like to focus a bit more on this immune response in the remaining 18 minutes. And I would like to work with the adaptive immune response, to show you the adaptive immune response, and a tiny little bit about natural killer cells. And yes, we are back at slide 2. Because during his talk, Mike not only challenged everything, or one of the things he also challenged was the methodology of how we look at things. And I would like to read one more section of his abstract. In the porcine model, investigators rely primarily on assessment of interferon gamma alone or in combination with IL-10 in bulk lymphocyte preparations. The consequent limitations of this approach have been analyzed previously and seriously weaken conclusions that PRRS might induce a Th2 response that impairs anti-PRRS immunity. So the disadvantage of this bulk analysis is what bothered him, and this is also what we would like to address in our lab and what we would like to do differently. So basically what these bulk analyses are missing is which cell is actually producing the interferon gamma. This is a really important information because not all interferon gamma producing cells can, for example, develop a really strong immunological memory, which is really crucial if you want to develop vaccines against PRRS. Where are these cells going? Are they going to the lymph nodes or are they going to the tissue? So here we have then also two different cell types. One is rather, if you think of the army in the reserve, and the other one are the frontline soldiers. So you want to have both that you actually can win the war against PRRS. Are these cells naive or antigen experienced? So is it their first exposure to just background, or is it a second exposure? Is that really a memory response? And are other non-interferon gamma or IL-10 producing cells responding? So if we only look at interferon gamma or IL-10, we might miss a lot of other things. So basically the question now is, how can we find answers to these 4 questions? And the approach we are using is polychromatic, or multicolor flow cytometry. Because in multicolor flow cytometry, you have a lot of cells, and each of these cells is now analyzed individually, and you can analyze in our lab up to 9 different parameters at a time. So you can analyze not only is interferon gamma produced, but you can also say which cell is it, how is it differentiating, are there other activation markers, is it a recall response or is it just the first response, and this gives you a whole other level of information. So in the next 15 minutes, we look now at the T-cell response during this infection and vaccination, and how they produce interferon gamma, how they are activated, how they differentiate, and how they home. So basically, for non-immunologists or non-research here in the room, what we do is we isolate blood from the animal, and then we re-stimulate these immune cells in blood, the PBMC, with different per strains. So we can also look at homologous or heterologous responses specific to whatever we show the cells in that system. We do that in vitro. And then next, what I would like to focus on at the beginning is that we look at the proliferation of cells and cytokine production. So if you look for proliferation, a very standard bulk method would be tritium-thymidine incorporation. It is very sensitive and easy to do. But you can also do flow cytometry. If you stain your cells at the beginning, then when they divide, they will lose that fluorescence, and this is what we can detect in flow cytometry. And for interferon gamma, one of the mostly used bulk methods is an ELISpot. And again, we can basically get the same results using flow cytometry. So how many cells are actually producing interferon gamma in our bulk analysis. And then we can say, okay, we have, let's say, 1,000 or 3,000 interferon gamma producing cells in a million of PBMC. So now the question is, if we can do just the same, why would we use flow cytometry to do that? And basically here is the answer. So as I said, we cannot only look at interferon gamma, we can also look, if we use different markers, if we have, for example, B cells, or if we have NK cells in our cell population, so in our mixed cell population, T cells, and then within the T cells we can say, okay, these ones are TCR gamma delta T cells, these ones are cytotoxic T-lymphocytes, and these ones are CD4 T helper cells. And now we can do that specifically for the cells which are producing interferon gamma. And if we do that, we can now not only answer that, for example, after a re-stimulation with VR2332, roughly 0.1% of the cells are actually producing interferon gamma. We can also say that within these interferon gamma producing cells, about 5% are B cells, 3% NK cells, 62% T cells, and if you look a bit more closer, 8% are TCR gamma delta cells, 10% CTLs, and the majority of these interferon gamma producing cells are actually CD4 T cells. So our system can then identify which cell is now producing that interferon gamma. Okay, so let's use that system to evaluate the T cell response to PRRS. And we already covered the neutralizing, the antibody response. I will not talk about B cells and natural killer cells right now. I would like to focus on the gamma delta T cells, CD4 T cells, and CD8 T cells. Yeah, that was a bit paused. If we look at the beginning at the overall T-cell response over the time course, we could see that the T-cell response basically peaked at about 28 days post-infection for all 4 groups. So you again see in gray the mock pigs, in blue the vaccinated pigs, and the 2 infected ones in orange and red. So basically the T-cell response peaked at around 28 days, and interestingly this was also the time when viremia actually dropped quite dramatically. So there was already quite some correlation with that. And I would just like to show you the local distribution, what we will look later on in a bit more detail for the different T-cell subsets, that the T-cells are basically the majority within all leukocytes in the tracheobronchial lymph node. In the lung we have about 20 to 30% of the leukocytes are T-cells, and they make up about 5 to 10% in the bronchoalveolar lavage. In the next 3 slides, I would then go through the 3 different T-cell subsets: cytotoxic T-lymphocytes, CD4s, and TCR gamma deltas. So if we look at first at the proliferation, it is again at around 28 days that actually we see a peak response. So it follows the standard T-cell response, but the frequency is very low, with about 1.5% of T-cells actually reacting to PRRS in this CTL population. If we then have a look at the interferon gamma production at 28 days, and what you see here is that we have pigs infected with a high path PRRS strain, low path MLV strain, and mock pigs, and then we re-stimulated them in vitro with exactly these 4 strains, either media, MLV, low path, or high path. So here we can analyze now the homologous and heterologous immune response. And for CTLs, we honestly don't see very much. So it's basically everything is one line. We have here some significancies, but in general, I would rather conclude that we have a low interferon gamma response of these CTLs. But what we did not analyze so far yet is how are they actually killing cells. So CTLs obviously have more than one function. They do not only produce interferon gamma, they can kill infected cells. And this is what we're going to do in the future. We want to look how are they active actually during that killing process. And for the local distribution of these CTLs, this is now a bit different. So here we look at within all T cells, we see that these CTLs are rather going to the lung and the bronchoalveolar lavage. Not too many actually are going to the lymph nodes. And what we also see is that if you have an in vivo PRRS infection, this actually increases the frequencies in these of CTLs in the lung and in the bowel. Good. If we compare that now to the T helper response, there's not much of a difference in regards to the time, but what we see is that the response is a lot stronger. So instead of 1.5%, we go up here to 10% of T cells are actually CD4 T cells responding to PRRS. So during that acute infection, these CD4 T cells are actually the strongest systemic responders with up to 2%. And then we performed a small correlation analysis, a Pearson correlation analysis, and we actually saw that these T helper cells really not nicely, but they did correlate with the viremia drop from 21 to 35 days post-infection. And as for the proliferation, the same is actually true for the interferon gamma production at 28 days. So at this peak of the response, we saw that homologous and heterologous production of interferon gamma in these CD4 T cells were actually the strongest of all T cells. So these CD4 T cells are the main interferon gamma producers systemically. And if we now look at the local distribution, these cells actually are rather found at necropsy at the tracheobronchial lymph node, and only a minority of them actually goes to the lung and to the bowel. So we do have about 20% of T cells are CD4 T cells, but the big majority is going to the lymph node. Okay, and the last one would be the TCR gamma delta cells, and now we see actually a bit of a different profile here. So while these TCR gamma delta cells are also proliferating with a peak at around 28 days post-infection, they have a second peak at 56 days post-infection. So this is not only during the acute infection, but also during the persistent infection. They become very, very active. And this is something what you would not see if you only look for interferon gamma production, for example, or for bulk proliferation. So this was quite surprising for us, and during that persistent phase of the infection, these TCR gamma delta cells were actually the biggest responders. At 28 days, if we go back to our standard peak for the immune response, again, as for CTLs, we do not see a strong interferon gamma response, and we haven't actually analyzed the late point data yet. And if we now look at the local distribution, we also see that these TCR gamma delta cells are rather going to the lung and to the bronchoalveolar lavage. But interestingly, PRRS decreases their frequency. How is that possible? So there are a few theories. One of the theories, what I have, is explained on the next slide. So the majority goes to lung and bowel, and PRRS decreases it. So it could be that these TCR gamma delta cells are actually leaving the lung during these late infections. And this is where also polychromatic flow cytometry comes in really handy, because in addition to proliferation and cytokine production and identifying the immune cell subset, you can also look at their effector function and the homing pattern of these T cells. So here we looked at the expression of CCR7, which is a marker for homing to the lymph node, versus CD27, which is a marker for, if you downregulate it, then you're rather in an effector phase of your life, basically, of the life of that T cell. And then we compared the CD4 T cells and the TCR gamma delta T cells. Because what we actually know about T cells and their homing during their development is mostly based on TCR alpha beta cells, and not too much about TCR gamma delta cells. So if we now have a look at what we, as immunologists, think this is also an accepted fact, is that naive T cells go to the lymph node, and only during their differentiation, once they saw their antigen, they would go into the tissue and can be there. Surprisingly, very surprisingly, for TCR gamma delta cells, this is exactly the opposite. So naive TCR gamma delta cells are going into the tissue, not into the lymph node. And this is what I did not expect. So I asked my PhD student, just do the same for TCR gamma delta cells, and he came back, it doesn't work. And I said, why doesn't it work? I said, yeah, that's the case, basically. Because naive T cells are homing to the tissue. And what we also saw is that if you now look for antigen experienced cells, so cells which already are activated, and we have a marker for that, so I did that in a pre-gating, we have basically here the position where the naive cells are, and here the position where the naive cells are, while the CD4 T cells rather go into tissue. So at the beginning they start in the lymph nodes, and then during their differentiation they go slowly into the tissue. These TCR gamma delta T cells now either have to decide, they either go into an effector phase and staying in the tissue, or they're going into a rather non-effector phase and go to the lymph node. And when we then compared the expression of the CCR7 marker, so where they will home, we found that proliferating TCR gamma delta T cells are going rather, so they do upregulate that CCR7 expression, and that means they would start to go into the lymph node. We did not see that if we looked for interferon gamma production. So this upregulation was only present in the proliferating ones. So basically what that indicates, it's not full proof yet, but that the proliferating TCR gamma delta cells would go up here, going to into the lymph node, and that the interferon gamma producing TCR gamma cells stay in the lung, and then these proliferating cells would fight during the persistent infection PRRS in the lymph nodes, and the TCR gamma delta cells producing interferon gamma in the tissue. So basically what we could conclude from that is that TCR gamma delta T cells have a reversed homing pattern. So they start as CCR7 negative ones, and then they do upregulate CCR7 positive. CCR7 becomes CCR7 positive, and that the proliferating TCR gamma delta T cells can leave the lung. So this could actually then lead, during a PRRS infection, that the drop in TCR gamma delta T cells is happening until necropsy, so that we have a decreased frequency of these TCR gamma delta cells. Good, it's 8:28. Let's wrap that up. Basically, this is a figure what we included in our latest publication on the studies, what I just presented to you. It was published in Viruses, and this is showing you the 3 states during a PRRS infection. So on the left side you see pre-infection, the TCR gamma delta cells are in the lung, travel from blood to lung, blood to lung. In contrast, the TCR alpha beta cells, so the CTLs and CD4s, are traveling blood, lymph node, lymph node. During the acute infection, I just want to highlight that here is actually where the CD4 T cells are the strongest responders systemically, and that during the infection then these TCR gamma delta T cells will start to upregulate CCR7 and go into the lymph node. And during persistent infection, we then have actually the TCR gamma delta T cells as the strongest responders, and a lot of them will still stay in the lung and produce interferon gamma, but some of them will start to go into the lymph node and fight PRRS during that persistent phase in the lymph nodes, where also PRRS is migrating to the lymph nodes. So we do not understand completely what these TCR gamma delta T cells are doing in the lymph node. This will be also part of our future studies, but we have good indication that they play a really important role in that. Good, and with that I would actually like to thank my team members and my colleagues at NC State. We have Andrew Kick, who is actually leading that PRRS project, and Amanda Emerell. She's here also with me, and she will be presenting her project on the chlamydia tomorrow morning. And then I would also like our basically swine immunity and infection team, Glenn Almond, Elisa Christie, who's also here, and Juliana Boninfera, and Jonathan Fogel, Laura Edwards, LAR, and a ton of student volunteers. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
Questions for Dr. Kaeser? We have microphone on the other side, you can use that one. So, but in the back side, I can run the microphone through.
Yes, very nice talk. I have a question about this neutralizing these PRRS viruses, which have delayed neutralizing antibody responses versus rather normal. Did you look for T-Rex and the role of T-Rex in these animals? And that's, yeah.
Yes, so we looked at that as well. This was basically my postdoc, right? So my PhD was describing T-Rex, and then afterwards I would like to see that what role are they playing in PRRS infection. And I hope with that study finally I can close that chapter and really say this is what's happening in pigs. And then we looked at our results, and once more, it's not that easy. So they do get activated, but they do get activated at a similar... So we looked at basically the ratio of the activity of Tregs to T helper cells before infection, during infection, and then we thought, okay, at one point we will see that Tregs are becoming more active than T helpers at a ratio, so that this ratio will drop. It did not happen. But it also did not go up as early as we would expect it. So it's somewhere in the middle. So until 28 days, the ratio stayed the same as before infection, and then the T helper response actually became more active. It doesn't answer the question yet. I'm sorry.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Any gamma delta knockout pigs in your future?
Yeah, that would be great. I would actually like to have a rainbow pig. That would be my dream. Like gamma deltas are glowing red, T helpers green.
Any more questions?
Maybe I missed. So when you infected the pig with the different PRRS strains, how many pigs were used in each group? Did you see the big variation about the neutral antibody production and interferon gamma production from between different pigs?
It was 6 pigs per group. The neutralizing antibodies were actually relatively consistent. So there was obviously variation. We are in an outbred model, but the variation was actually quite fine. I do have... I hit the slide. Sorry. I actually have the slide of each animals in a hidden slide. They were actually quite coming up at the same time.
Your interesting work with why the neutralizing antibody is so different with VR2332 versus the low or high path. What do you think is going on there?
So my theory for the delayed neutralizing antibody response is actually that you have some decoy epitopes, and maybe, or glycosylation, and maybe in these new strains you do not have that glycosylation of the really neutralizing epitopes, or that the decoy epitopes are actually expressed less. So these would be the two reasons I think.
Your assay, is it that with mark cells, or are you using pig cells?
The assay, I think that was, he did that I think on MA104, so I would have to double check with we did both, but for this one I think we did MA104s.